All right. Welcome everyone. Thanks for calling in from all over the globe. If you see my eyes darting, it's because I am admitting folks uh, one by one as the rest of us come in. It's going to be a really great group today. So hello, my name is Renee Davis, and I'm really excited to be leading this event for Terra today. I was part of the Zebra cohort back in 2023 for the flagship Terra LFA program. And let me admit, like many of you, that program was really meaningful because it marked my transition from 15 years in general tech and high growth fintech startups and moving into the world of climate tech. So that was a really important sort of like fork in the road for me. But even more importantly, it was also the beginning of a chapter in my career where I finally feel like my personal passions are now aligned with my professional work. And that's a really neat feeling and fulfilling feeling to have. Today, I work as a strategic advisor, a fractional CPO, and a leadership coach. And over the last 3.5 years since Terra, I've had the opportunity to work in a lot of amazing industries, building decarbonization, measurement and verification analytics, and reducing single-use plastic waste at sports stadiums. So some really cool companies. And I'm also the co-architect of a methodology called Product Market Earth Fit. If you haven't heard of it and want to learn more, feel free to ping me after the event. And I built that in partnership with another amazing Terra grad, Anu Sangvi. And so what I love about Terra is not only that it allows us and empowers us to really make these career pivots, but also for the wonderful friendships, relationships, and community it brings together, just like today's event. So really excited to introduce my other speakers here with me today. I have Alicia and Chris. I'll start with Alicia. Alicia is a product manager at PV Case, which is a B2B SaaS company who helps renewable energy project developers go through the permitting and approval process. So luckily, it doesn't take everyone 15 years to find the climate tech train. Alicia found it much faster, but she has a geographical twist to her story. So, Alicia, I'll let you introduce yourself and share how you found your climate tech path in Europe.
Sure. Thanks, Renee. So, hey everyone, my name is Alicia, and I was in the axolotl cohort. I think that's the one after Renee's. So, as Renee kind of mentioned, I had a geographical shift. So, basically, I'm originally from Taiwan, but currently I'm based in Italy. And when I arrived in Italy, I was trying to build my network and learn about the European space. And by chance, I got in touch with the local Terra Madre, the slow food organizations, and that really turned on something for me, realizing that I could combine my passion for the climate with my expertise of tech. So then I went on to study at Terra.do, and it kind of opened up my eyes and connected me to a lot of alumni and also people in Italy that are also trying to shift their careers towards climate. And so, yeah, luckily, my mentor at Terra.do connected me to one of their ex-colleagues who worked at PV Case. And so that's how things kind of kicked off for me. But before working in the solar industry, I've been in healthcare and startup tech consulting, working with products across different industries like sports ed, ride sharing, and a mix of B2B and B2C. But yeah, I'm very happy to be here to share my journey and the different to share like different products that I've been working at with PVKs and how that's different from the past products that I've worked on. Renee, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. My dog was barking. Thank you, Alicia. Now we'll switch it over to Chris, who we can all congratulate because he is a new dad and he's working in climate tech. How awesome is that? So Chris is an engineer turned product manager, and he works in the utility space. He has a really nice breadth because he's worked both for the utility grid operator and moved up to now working at the parent company. So Chris, why don't you do a intro on your background and your segue into climate tech, which I think is the fastest out of all of us.
Sure, yeah. I began my career as an engineer. I worked in construction, I worked on transit projects. Um, I wanted to move back to Philly for personal reasons, and found myself at the power company, enjoyed doing that for a few years. Was more interested in thinking about why things get built versus building things, and moved over to product management about a year and a half ago.
Wonderful. All right, so our whole goal about today's conversation is to pay it forward a bit and to share some unique perspectives that we've gained working within climate tech. And specifically because of the background overlap today, we're going to talk a lot about energy and infrastructure and working in those domains. And our intent is to share those, share some lessons that we've learned, and really allow everyone to take on those perspectives and those lessons learned so you can leverage that moving forward in your product career. So working in the energy industry or infrastructure is oftentimes really kind of iconic for a lot of climate tech people because we all know how deeply important it is for this renewable transition to happen and to happen as quickly as possible. But what's really unique about that industry overall is that it's really complex and it operates pretty differently than traditional product SaaS companies. So today we're going to start there and talk about how working in that you often observe that products and companies move slower and less predictably than you might expect if you're coming from a big tech background or from another domain. So we'll talk a bit about how we have each experienced that and some unique stories and perspectives that we've encountered as we've learned that over time and sometimes the hard way. So Alicia, I'll start with you again. Can you share a time where you thought something would scale quickly, but it didn't?
Yeah, sure. So just to give a brief background about PBK, so we're kind of a global company. We have customers in over like 80 countries. So our vision is to build an ecosystem that supports solar projects from the beginning, so its birth, all the way to its construction phase. And so an important part for us when we're building products is to not just pay attention to the users, but looking more at the market because it really shapes how we build the product. So there are a couple examples that I could share on, but one thing that comes to mind is a product that I'm working on now is new for our company, and so the biggest question for us in the beginning is, do we focus on the US, Europe, or Asia? Because we're present in all of these regions, and it really, yeah. So this is an important point because the way that engineers design in each region is very different. So that kind of changes our go-to-market strategy. So when we build something for the US, for example, it doesn't really replicate exactly in the European market. And a simple example is in the early stages when people are looking for land in US, there's a lot of land available and they're typically very flat. But when you shift that perspective into Europe, it completely changes the way engineers work because the lands are way much tighter and the engineers have to do much more manipulations to get to their project goal. So I think this is a big thing in energy solutions. You really have to pay attention to the market you're building for. And so on top of that, the different user habits, we also had to think about how does the market trend look, because in the US, the market is kind of slowing down in terms of new projects, but in Europe, it's growing. So there's a lot of trade-offs that we have to consider. And another interesting example is one of our product that's helping users to find available land. Its value proposition is by helping to aggregate a lot of the different public data sources and additional computations to help people make decisions more quicker. And another example, the same thing as the previous one, is that this product is very, very extremely successful in the US, but when we try to enter in Europe, we run into the bottleneck of GDPR. In Europe, regulations are much stricter and the data is not easily available. So that road to expansion to different markets is a lot tougher. So that also impacts a lot of where the company heads and the strategy and so on and so forth. So yeah, one thing about this energy industry is that it's very heavily influenced by the external factors and a lot of things that you have to think about.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing such specific examples. I love the ability to pattern match, so take real examples that I've heard and then start to see the patterns of how I can apply that into what I'm doing. And so I always try to encourage that in our conversations. And one thing I want to highlight for everyone, and to contrast between typical SaaS, where I spent 15 plus years, and what we see in climate tech often, and especially within this energy and infrastructure ecosystem, is the progression of what a product innovation cycle looks like. So in SaaS, you typically, you build, you ship it, you iterate. And some of the most innovative companies will build first, so the product leads, and then the environment adapts. You can see this with some of our iconic big tech companies, Slack. Teams used to use emails and have very asynchronous conversations. And then with this new product, we all shifted the way we work. And now we talk in channels and in real time. And it's a very different dynamic than where we were a decade plus ago. With Stripe. When they came out, they were API first, and now all payment companies are API first, right? So the environment is adapting to this new product expectation. You can think of Notion, where previously we had docs and databases and wikis, and they were all separate, and now it's all blended and it's together. And so we're very much used to leading with the product, and if the product is strong, the environment adapts around that new product. But within the energy ecosystem, it's very different. Usually the environment leads, and then the product has to fit into it. And it moves and it progresses a lot slower. So you don't have as much room to shape the environment as you would have likely become accustomed to in a traditional SaaS industry. And some examples, let me just admit a few more folks. Some examples for that are related to what Alicia just shared, where they have to go see what available land there is and then figure out, how do I work within that. You have to figure out what are the policies, and then how do you work within that. And you might be able to change and influence policies and regulations, but that takes time. So it's really a different mindset that you're coming in with. And some folks really enjoy this because when you have constraints, it actually opens up many doors for innovation because you now have a structure to be able to think and be creative in. So, Chris, I'll pass the mic over to you. I'd love to hear from your experience, things that you thought would have progressed more quickly, but ended up taking a lot longer, and why.
Sure. One thing I just want to speak about is like the geographic thing I think is relevant for us as well. One thing I was thinking about is there's this policy that we have to comply with, but it's different state by state, right? We operate grids in Philly, New York, excuse me, Philly, Chicago, DC, Baltimore, like, and they're all in different states and they all have different regulators. So what works in Pennsylvania doesn't work in Illinois. So that's a consideration we have to make. Um, you also talked a little bit about like not be what how we lag or what gets implemented. Many times the we can't implement something until the regulators approve it. Um, for instance, like what we it took us a long time to get funding to deploy one of our more recent products. And that was like a matter of getting the KPI approved and then making sure the regulators would be okay with that. Something that would have taken, maybe a month at a SaaS company took us about a year. So it's a definitely a slower moving organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love Chris's example of aligning around a KPI. And I'd love for you to share more about this. What I found really interesting in that story was that, up to a couple years ago, there was no unifying KPI to rally around, no like specific North Star to really guide how residential solar adoption is progressing and is measured. And that process took a year to align around that KPI. But now that you have, it's much more streamlined. So, Chris, why don't you share a little bit more about that story?
Sure, yeah. we have these different operating companies running the grids in the different cities. And there's no one unified metric that we had to see how we're doing in terms of solar adoption. The purpose of my product is to help with solar adoption. But every utility was looking at it differently, and it wasn't until really this year that we were finally able to decide on the one simple metric that we use to track our progress towards the goal. We're looking at nameplate capacity. So when you install a solar system, it's rated for a certain limit, and our goal is to have 10 to 16 gigawatts of solar by 2035. I was just looking at this. We have about like 40, 50 gigawatts of total capacity. So it would be a substantial portion of our total grid capacity would become solar if we meet this goal. Um, but yeah, it wasn't until relatively recent that we all decided to point our efforts in one direction.
Hmm. So you have this more complex ecosystem that we're all working within, right? Where we're not just designing for the users and creating an awesome product, but we have to design within the limits of the grid, around the policy, around the infrastructure that's in place. But even within the company, sometimes it takes longer or it's more complex to really orient everyone around a specific goal and how we're going to measure success. But the important part is, it's completely possible. And once we do that, just like the benefits we see in traditional SaaS, it really allows momentum and movement to move forward and unlocks that. So coming back to some of this policy and regulation, which for I think nearly every company who's within the energy infrastructure space, these types of things are very much outside of our direct control, outside of the company's direct control. So I'm curious, Alicia and Chris. Chris, we'll start with you. How do you navigate some of these infrastructure challenges that you can't directly control and influence?
Hmm. I think when you have a something you can't influence externally, right? We have long lead lobbying and things we do to like help. We work with regulators. We have good relationships with them, and we work to seek out favorable outcomes with them. But internally, I think it's a big change management issue. That's something we work hard to do. That's something that we're a company striving to get better at. But it's a concerted effort. I came from an engineering background, and that was not something that, was typical for us to do. You get your project, you build it, you move it on. But now there's a bigger organizational, like how do you get adoption question that we have to think about.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things we have to learn as product people who are, still at the core responsible for taking things across the finish line is how do we adapt to that environment and how do we take the constraints that we're operating within and what changes in how we operate. So Alicia, why don't you share how you've shifted your product practice to be more adaptable to this world of regulations and the constraints you have to work within?
Yeah, for sure. So at PBK's, a good thing that we have is we have the market research team, and also a lot of our employees came what they used to be in the solar engineering industry. So as PM and product teams, we're very tightly intertwined with those people. So we're always feeling the pulse and checking in with them to see how they see the market. And especially with the people on the sales floor, they're actively talking to customers and going to conferences. They're able to inform us of what's coming and what are the major policies that we should be aware of. Because for us, building a product in throughout the world, so we're not just in the US, we're not just in Europe, it's really hard to always have these things top of mind. So at PBKs, it's really great to have these go-to-market teams that specialize in specific regions to make the product teams aware and always feeling the pulse. So another thing that as product team we always do is to make sure we're always constantly checking in with customers. So checking in monthly or weekly with customers that are in different regions to make sure that we are always up to date with their latest process and what their latest pain points are. So, for example, a lot of them in the US are starting to tell us that, okay, they don't need that much of citing products because now, due to the changes in regulations or the policy incentives, they're moving to try and push more of the solar construction out. So, these are the things that you could only find out if you're actively talking to customers And sometimes if you're not able to do that directly with customers, you always have other teams supporting you. For us, it's like the market research team and also the go-to-market team.
Hmm. Having a pulse on what's happening in all of these different dimensions is highly critical. And just having the ability to adapt, right? And I call it to reinvent the part of the business that needs to change in order to be able to move forward and create that business value and customer value at the same time. From my experience in building decarbonization, it's the same, making sure that you're able to keep tabs on what are the regulations that are changing, because those create incentives, and those incentives make it economically viable and lucrative in many different geographical areas to be able to invest in building decarbonization projects, which cost money up front, but then have a long payoff of ROI, like installing solar or smart devices, reducing water in different fixtures, things like that. But it's at the same time that we're looking at, being adaptable to regulations, we also want to make sure we're staying adaptable to creative financial solutions. So within building decarbonization, and I think this also hit renewable energy industries as well, there was a change in terms of tax law that allowed unique financing to happen, where larger companies who had a larger tax liability would be able to offset that by working with a company who was investing in some sort of renewable energy project. And that unlocked a lot of financial possibility within the sector. So it's important to make sure that as a company or as a product person operating within this space, you're keeping a pulse, and you have good relationships with your stakeholders and cross-functional team if there's specific jobs um, oriented around this. If not, it's kind of up to you to make sure you're keeping that pulse, but to understand the policy, the regulations from a geographical perspective and where you're operating in, where there's opportunity, and also from a financial incentive package to make sure that you're balancing the two and finding the creative option in terms of fitting into the regulation and fitting into the financial economic part of it to create that business value for the company and ultimately, deliver to this higher mission of transitioning to a renewable world. All right, I'd love to talk a bit about lessons we've learned. I think that when you learn something the hard way, it sticks with you so much longer than when you did something right and everything worked out beautifully. So let's talk about some of the lessons we carry, and lessons specifically related to trying to scale a pilot in the world of climate. Chris, I'll start with you. Tell us a story about a mistake you saw or the company experience, and what's one of the lessons that you carry that you think is valuable for us to keep in mind?
Sure. And this is like where I started thinking about change management. It's not in my product roles back when I was an engineer, but it was our job to deploy. My boss had me deploy new meters out in the system. Our old ones, the gray box on the side of your house, the old ones were reaching end of life. We had to uh, we had to assess all the ones in the market and pick one to install. And there was like people who just did not want to do it. They for some reason did not like the brand. They didn't want to do the testing. And I realized like even if you have like there are people who have key points where they can veto your projects, and it's a matter of like talking to them on the front end. If you show up to them with like a list of tests that you've done and you say like, okay, we check all this. If someone's not comfortable and you don't have that like personal connection with them before, or at least like if the first time you're bringing up this with them is in front of their boss or something like that, it puts them in a really bad position. So it's being like sure to make sure that you do this deliberately, making sure you do it methodically, make sure that whenever someone is going to have to change something or change their opinion, you don't put them in a position where they'll feel uncomfortable doing it. I was really, I guess, shocked by how much of it was like a person management thing as opposed to like a deeply technical thing.
Hmm. Yeah, we all know as good product managers, the first time our critical stakeholders should hear about a product decision or proposal is not at the product review. We should be getting that alignment in advance, being able to address any concerns or questions in advance. And even more so in this industry because there's lots of domain experts who come from a much more traditional thought process and risk tolerance. We want to make sure that we're getting alignment up front because if we don't, you risk getting that project vetoed. And Chris, tell us how long it took to finally get it passed through.
This it took like about a year to get it passed through, and right, like it seemed like a pretty simple thing. Like we're gonna just approve these meters and run these tests, but to end up taking a year, and a big part of it was one of the key stakeholders like retired. We were pushing on him, and we were going through the escalation process, but then when we saw like the email that he was retiring, we're like, all right, this is we just cut our timeline down. So yeah, it's these personal things matter a lot.
Yeah, I love that. So the lesson is do it right, get the stakeholder alignment up front because if you don't, you might not be able to get it passed until that stakeholder retires. Luckily for Chris, that was only a year and not many, many more. Alicia, why don't you share your big lesson learned?
Yeah, for sure. And just before I share mine, I want to add just an anecdote that is sometimes when I speak to customers, I'm always surprised at how long it takes for a solar project to move through the funnel. Sometimes they say they've been at the company for 6 years and they still haven't seen the light of day for the projects that they're working on because it takes years to get through the stages of permitting, etc. But yeah, for my my background, what I've worked on, if we think about, I think it's helpful to give more context to the solar project. It's kind of like a funnel. In the beginning of the stages when the projects are born, there are a lot of projects, but as they move through the different stages of solar, they kind of get killed. They die because they don't get the permits, they don't get the funding that they need. So for PV case, in the beginning, our company has a very strong hold in the detail engineering stage. So it's kind of at the kind of at the end of the funnel after the projects have gotten financed and the land is secured. So the problems that we were solving as a company is primarily in the later stages. So when we were thinking about our next product, the natural progression is moving from ground mount solar projects to supporting also rooftop solar projects. And when we were trying to do discovery for how to build out this product, we were relying a lot on the customers we already have, which are in the ground mounted detail engineering stages. So customers working on these projects. But looking back, or I guess when we're trying to expand and move into new markets for our rooftop product, we kind of realized that we actually missed out on the bigger pie. We were building for a solution that is down here when the bigger market is up here. And it was hard for us to go back into kind of serve these customers because typically the personas in these top of the funnel are non-technical roles. So they rely on tools that are web-based and easier, and they don't want to use CAD solutions, which is what our company was primarily focused on. So this really impacts how we build products after this experience. We are always asked, okay, are you sure about the market you're entering? So the geos that I mentioned, but also kind of the stages that we are targeting. Um, yeah, and so it's interesting to always have to keep our mind open when we are doing interviews. Sure, we're speaking with people that are working specific stages, but we also have to keep in mind that, okay, not to lock ourselves into the only experience that we are learning now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as product managers, we need to be able to zoom out and see the big picture and then also zoom in and sweat the details. And so being able to do that. And when you see that opportunity to be able to pull the whole team out with you, to be able to then compare those opportunities and go after the one that's actually larger and more compelling and not get pigeonholed to the one that's just right in front of you. I love that example. For me, one of the lessons that I see, I've actually seen in regular tech as well. I've now worked in over 8 different industries. And as an advisor and as a fractional CPO, I now work more frequently with companies, so I see examples more often surface. And the mistake that I see is something that occurs pretty frequently when a company moves from an early adopter audience to early mainstream. And I think this is a little bit more prevalent in climate tech because of the people who gravitate to working in that. So I'll explain more. Usually when we are transitioning from an early adopter audience, we're moving from a certain product positioning that's very values oriented. Early adopters tend to gravitate to products that align with their values, and they're willing to pay more for it. They're willing to invest time if it's not really working properly, if it's a little bit buggy. They're much more tolerant. But then when you find product market fit there and you're growing, you're expanding, the world is great, and you're moving into an early adopter, an early mainstream audience, this audience becomes a lot more pragmatic. It becomes much more of an economic decision and not a values-based decision. And so the way you position your product needs to evolve in order to be relevant to this new market that you're going after. And in climate tech, I've seen that struggle be even greater than what I've seen in regular tech. And my hypothesis is that it's because of those who gravitate to work in climate tech. We are so values aligned as employees and want to, make the world a better place, that it's even harder for us to be able to step back and see that transition we have to make. So not only are our customers resonating at a values level, either they want to move to renewable energy, they have zero waste goals, they have ESG sustainability goals, and now we're trying to move to early mainstream where companies might have some of those, but they're doing it more from an economic interest than a mission-driven interest, right? And we personally align very much with the values-based interest. So it's hard and difficult for us as product leaders and for a company to be able to zoom out and say, how do we reposition our products without losing the essence of why we're all inspired and motivated to work on this? But in order to really have a big scaled impact, we need to be able to capture that early mainstream. So just an example from my career, when I was working with a company, Bold Reuse, to eliminate or reduce single-use plastic waste used at large-scale sports stadiums by providing an economy and option for reusable cups and containers. The way that they resonated with their early adopters was very much around being sustainable and eliminating single-use plastic waste, and just resonating so much on that values that the sports stadiums who were more mission driven, were part of the Green Sports Alliance, would just resonate, and that was kind of good enough. But when they're trying to now grow and get traction with early mainstream, so just sort of like general large scale sports stadiums, that messaging wasn't really working. And one of the shifts they needed to make was to position it around how it's actually going to help those sports stadiums meet their goals and the other benefits it has. So one example is when you are using a reusable product, it's staying very local in your economy. So people are coming to pick it up, it's going to a wash hub, it's getting cleaned, it's going to get returned. And so the cost associated with that is very stable, right? It's very predictable. It's very consistent month over month, year over year. And when you're buying single-use items, you're generally buying them from overseas suppliers. So one thing that's happened in the past year is tariffs have become really unpredictable and also really expensive. And so it's much more volatile for finance to forecast how much are these single-use plastic cups, which we're buying hundreds of thousands of, going to cost over time. How do I model that? And how do we budget for it when it's like all over the place with tariffs and costs and supply chain and gas prices? It's much more volatile and unstable and brings a lot of risk into the company. So by moving to something that's reusable and circular, you eliminate all of that and you're able to bring a much more stable cost forecast, which is really important to big companies. So that's just one example of how do we shift around what are the value propositions that are really strong, meaningful, and oftentimes don't have to do with the climate impact for early mainstream. But by showing them how this is valuable within their own company, within their own system, we actually are able to create more adoption and have a greater sized impact than we would if we just stuck with our original positioning. So that's one of the lessons that I carry, and I'm always looking for when a company is at that stage and they're trying to kind of cross the chasm is like, how are we um, marketing and positioning our product for our early adopters, and are we actually still in the early adopter market, or are we transitioning? And then what does that mean we have to evolve into? All right, we have one more question, then we're going to switch to some audience Q&A. So if you already have a question in mind, please put that in the chat. Thanks, Tillman. He has our first question we'll get to in a couple minutes. So as we segue into that, knowing that this audience are product managers or product professionals who are either interested in working in the climate tech energy ecosystem, we might already be working in that, or we're just curious about what it's like to work there. Can you share, we'll do like a quick rapid fire round of these questions. What is one PM instinct that you had to shift or change in order to be successful working in this space? And we'll go Alicia, then Chris.
Man, I was thinking about my answer. An instinct that I have to shift. I think it would be how closely I have to work with the market research team and the go-to-market team. I mean, previously the market wasn't changing that fast, and it wasn't the industries I was working at, it wasn't moving that fast, and there weren't that many regions that I had to keep track of. And so I think this is something that just the pulse on the market shifts. So where our customers are going and how the policies are in place in different regions of the world are impacting their habits and where they're going has been much more amplified, yeah, in the energy industry.
Mm-hmm. Great one, Chris.
Something I found is when part of what we were doing was seeking to create digital tools to help with solar adoption. And something like we weren't getting many clicks on those sites on the educational material. Um, so I guess I was more used to big data sets and being able to like refine with like big lot of data to help you drive your decision, whereas we had a little bit less of that. Um, and you have to rely on like other methods to help figure out exactly what your path forward is. That's a big
Mm-hmm.
change for me.
Mm-hmm. My big instinct I had to shift, and this is coming from someone who has worked in the 0 to 1 space for half of her career, right? So um, very agile, very iterative, very quick. And it's shifting my aperture of what does successful change look like. And in climate tech, because it's inherently more systems based, change requires more puzzle pieces to be in place in order for it to hit that tipping point. And if we're expecting it to happen in this amount of time and with this amount of effort, but it really takes this amount of time and like this amount of effort, then our benchmark is off. So being able to have more patience and to lean more on that systems perspective is even more important in working in climate tech and within the energy infrastructure than it is in other industries.
Give it to me, bus, enough.
All right, next question. What PM skill becomes even more important out of the product skill set than it ever was before? I'll go first and give you guys a minute to think because you have your thinking face on. I would say storytelling, and this relates back to my lesson learned moving from early adopter to early mainstream audiences, is your ability to storytell. And as part of storytelling, it's being able to decipher what is the leading value proposition that's going to create alignment for this initiative. Uh, it seems a little bit more obvious in other industries and within this space, and especially when you have a climate tech product and you're trying to gain adoption outside of a climate tech audience, you need to choose, like, am I leading with the business value? Am I leading with the customer value? Or more rarely, am I leading with the sustainability value? But either way, all of those options will lead to adoption and a meaningful impact for what you're trying to push forward. So it's your ability to decipher and storytell effectively between those. Alicia, what do you think has even more important as a PM skill set in this space?
Yeah, I like to jump on what you said. So storytelling, but maybe for me, it's more storytelling for the stakeholders also critically important. Um, Oftentimes when I'm working on in PVKs, because we have a lot of different products and people kind of focus on different stages of the solar project. So it's really important to be able to understand the varying user profiles that our company is solving for and be able to package that in a nice story to convince the different stakeholders in the company why your product is solving something critical and why these user problems are important to solve. So it's I would say, two skills. So storytelling, aside from what Renee has already mentioned. So, but for me, I would also just add like storytelling for stakeholders, plus the skill of being empathetic to your users. So being able to understand the different complexities that they work in and how to segment them and pick out
Shahed
the
عن
user
طريقك
problems. That
النكتة.
All right, let me mute that person. I muted you by accident.
yeah, no, but that's pretty much it. So
Thank you. Chris, what about you?
I think like what drew me to product management originally is like dealing with ambiguity. And like I think this is a really ambiguous space. Right? Like policies changing, corporate incentives are changing, customers are changing. Like it's keeping the ball rolling, trying to stay productive when like you don't know what it's going to look like in like a couple months, I think has been like a that's been a key skill that I have had to sharpen being in this role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. It's being comfortable with ambiguity and knowing how to navigate that and take a team along with you. All right, let's transition to Q&A. If you have a burning question, put it in the chat or put it in the actual Q&A segment. I have both of those open, so we'll be working our way through it. We're going to start with Tillman, and I'll read your question, then you're welcome to come off mic if you want to add anything to it. In transition from a more he's transitioning from a more consumer facing product management role and wants to move into climate tech. And as we know, roles are called different things in different industries, right? That even the term product management is still making its product managers making its way through from tech into other industries and companies. So he's curious from our experience, is that role and the skill set that we're bringing, is that role in climate tech still called product manager, or is it sometimes called something else? Because he's noticing that there's less product management roles in climate tech, and if he's wondering, is that just because there's less of them, or is that because they're actually calling it something else and he doesn't have that vocabulary yet? Tillman,
That
anything you
was
want to add?
super well paraphrased. Thank you.
Alicia, it sounded like, looks like you had a thought there.
yeah, it's a great question. Because personally for PVKs at least, and in the energy space that I've worked with, like our competitive companies, when I look at their posting in software, at least they have been called product managers or product owners, but sometimes in our company we also have subject matter experts working in the product space. So yeah, you're right, they're not typically just product managers, but they could be more like product engineers or subject matter experts that have worked in the solar industry, and would like to support on shaping the future of the product.
Chris, do you have perspective on this?
I think it depends like company size. I think that's like a big key thing here. Like a smaller company, I think it like titles matter less. It's kind of getting in the door, whereas like I think maybe in a bigger company it's more defined. But yeah, I've seen program manager is like I've seen it overlap there.
Hmm.
I agree that it is ambiguous and there's never one translation.
The
Yeah, I would double down on that where in my 4 fractional roles, 2 of them, I coming in as like that fractional CPO role, I was the first product person coming into the team. And so, particularly in climate tech, where if it's not a specific tech company, like PV Case is building a SaaS product, so they're like in more of that tech company boat, but in many climate tech companies, there's a very heavy hardware component or professional services component. For example, in the reusable container company, it's a logistics company, right? So it's not tech first, it's like professional services first. And in those worlds, product is usually not a defined role. So if they don't have a product team, but they're kind of like hitting that mature seed or series A part, and there's tech to enable them, then they will need a product manager, but they probably don't know that or don't call it that. So if you're flexible to come in like in operations and then after you kind of learn the business, be able to be like, hey, like I can actually help with something else. I've seen that coming into the company, I've seen that as other folks who started in either customer success or operations or from engineering come in and say like, hey, I noticed this need and I have the skill set. Can I step in and help with this? And what they're helping with is like more of a traditional product management project or ownership. So that's one kind of frustration thing is that it's not a role that's well understood or labeled yet in many climate tech companies. And so we're part of the cohort that really has to pave the road because it's not really paved for us very well yet. Okay, we'll move to Dan's question. If policy constraints are so critical to building climate tech products, do your companies also have groups that aim to influence policy itself? And if they do, how do you collaborate with that? So I think this is touching on like, are there lobbyists? Are they called that? How do they kind of go about and approach policy change?
I mean, I can speak to this very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we have lobbyists. We have people who do that, who have to work with the states to get favorable outcomes. Like that's every big company does, and it's just part of it. Um, yeah, absolutely. And I don't think we collaborate them directly, but we're part of the same strategy that's seeking to adopt solar. So even though I'm not talking to the lobbying people, we're all kind of aligned over the overall mission.
Yeah, I
Dan,
think,
go ahead.
yeah, sorry. So I think PVK is a step removed from this policy thing because we serve companies like the ones that Chris is working for. But for us, as we have people that are more lobbying for software standards. So because in the solar project cycle, there are a lot of different tools that are being used, and something that the solar industry is kind of catching up on is these software standards to ensure that there's a reduced in data loss and for the projects to be handed over to different parties more efficiently. So our company does have a team that is actually in these what do you call that, like these areas of the industry to advocate for what we need for where the industry should head in terms of serving our customers who work on solar projects digitally.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add a perspective that from that I've seen, being close to other folks in climate tech within my network, and that's if a company doesn't have, maybe they're too small to really be able to influence policy at their size or invest in it, because sometimes it can be expensive to have a dedicated person who has to travel and be at these different conferences and trade shows and meetings. What they'll do is they'll join a coalition or an NGO that's collectively aiming to push something forward. And even if it's not because of budget constraints, those types of organizations can actually have an outsized impact when the government, either because they're too busy, there's too many focuses, or they're just not interested, like our current administration, the private sector can actually drive things forward through that coalition. And I have a friend who works in plastics and packaging for Mars, and um, she's very active in those coalitions, working together with L'Oreal and other big companies so that collectively they can get enough of the big players in the private sector to align on moving to a more sustainable route, that they can essentially create that regulation or peer pressure within the industry to all move towards this direction. And anyone who's not is now differentiated in like a negative way in the market. So just something to think about where when you're thinking about policy and change, sometimes it's, how do I work with the government and influence that policy directly? But then bringing that systems mindset, if I can't do that, or that type of change isn't going to be effective or near term, how else can I try to drive that change by working together with other players who are interested in similar things and collaborating so that we can drive forward change that influences us positively as a group? All right, going down the chat now. I see Nami made a comment that it's impossible to model this administration's policies, and I would completely agree. And I think that we need to consider, how do we actually use that to feed our value proposition, right? Because it's so volatile and unstable, what is the negative impact of that? And I think that's very directly related to being able to forecast, which is like a business's bread and butter. If you can't forecast your budget and your costs, like you're in a terrible high risk spot. So how do we use that as a reason to switch to more sustainable options that can bring that forecasting stability for a company's financial models? So try to, positively leverage that while it's there, and hopefully it won't be there for too long. All right, so Mandy's talking a bit about the end of life of climate tech products. Because a lot of climate tech companies are hardware related, at the end of life, there's hardware that needs to be disposed of or recycled, or something needs to happen to it. So it's the end of the supply chain life cycle. Now, Mandy, do you have a specific question you want to ask related to this?
Yeah, hi. So I was just thinking about that because I live in Florida, so I have folks coming to my door left, right, and center, constantly asking me if I want to put solar panels on my house. And despite the incentive programs and being a conservationist myself, no one has given a good answer when I ask, where are these panels going to be in 30 years when they are dead, right? And I've never been given a good answer on that. So I wanted to kind of probe you guys on that to see, is that something you're discussing, and who's thinking about that, where the responsibility lies, because I think that is something that is going to impact the future of sustaining those models. And then secondly, it kind of led me into, I'm actually preparing a talk myself to speak on conservation tech in about 2 weeks, and at a big tech conference. And I've been thinking a lot about the nature positive side of the house and how to bring that more into the work we do in tech product leadership. And so I wanted to see if you guys actually use nature to map as a stakeholder, and how you apply that, because in my head, that's, kind of a piece of the pie that is very different than the way we look at impact today, and therefore the value. So just want to see your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Mandy, that's a great question. It's actually also the very first question that I asked our CEO when I first joined the company. Um, I think joining a climate tech company, I really thought, nature would be a big part of our stakeholder. But I think I've come to terms with that. There's always a balancing act that we have to kind of manage. In the current climate, companies are working on tighter margins, and so oftentimes these are sadly pushed to the side. But of course, we're trying to increase and speed up the energy transition. But for me, it's also extremely important to talk about the demand part. The demand for energy continues to increase. It supports our company vision. It gives us more profits because we're moving towards renewables and to support these increasing demands. But at the same time, it's creating more waste 30 years down the road, like you mentioned. So I think this is a complex topic that I'm also trying to kind of think through as I work in the climate tech world. Our company is trying to work on these end of life solutions, trying to work our way down through the project cycle, but it's bit by bit. And a lot of times, like we uncovered today in this session, it's heavily driven by policies. So where the policies is headed, where the incentives are placed, that's unfortunately where the businesses will be heading.
The way that I think about this is um, if I put my like near-term hat on, I get frustrated and like depressed. But if I put my systems thinking hat on, I feel like that allows me to be more open-minded about it. And with that perspective, it's about trusting that we will innovate in time. When we think about climate tech, we're building typically, I would say in probably 99% of the cases, very high quality hardware that lasts for 10, 20, 25 plus years in solar. And so even at the end of that warranty life, they're still useful. And actually, in solar panels, there's a really strong secondary market for used solar panels because they're still functioning. They're just not as efficient because, you know, solar panels can do the same in one panel that it used to be able to do in two or three. But there's still a need for them. And when we think about what does that look like, we have time to figure it out. We have 10 years, 20 years. Like when we think about electric cars, batteries, we didn't really have a great way to recycle batteries when electric cars were first coming out 10 plus years ago. But now we have made huge progress, and there's a lot of even with the IRA through the Biden administration. I think there's like two huge companies in the U.S. that are got funding to build out factories to recycle batteries and components and do the chemistry they need to be able to reuse all of those minerals. So I think that we have to see it in a way of how do we build the best version of what we can build today in a way that gives it the highest chance of being able to be reused in the future. So if it's a high quality solar panel, it can still continue past its like warranted end of life, or the materials can be reused into something else. How do we design it for repairability? So we're designing it sustainability up front so it can be repaired and reused over time, and sort of believe that collectively we're going to push through the regulation needed so that it can't just be disposed of at the end. It has to be turned into something else. And we'll figure that out because we're giving ourselves 10, 20 years of life within that product that we're putting to market. And I think that's a very different mindset than you would see in something like fast fashion, where they're not coming with that high quality, long life mindset. And that's a completely different story. But in climate tech, we're putting out products that are much higher quality and have a much longer life. And so we got to kind of trust in our community that we're going to be innovative and creative and resourceful and figure it out over a decade, which is a long time to be innovative and drive progress.
Thank you.
All right, we are actually over time. So thank you everyone who's stayed with us till the end. I hope this was really insightful for you. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or Alicia or Chris. We're really happy we got the chance to come together and have this community discussion and Q&A. And on that, we'll say bye, and we'll see you at the next Terra event.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.